And moving on, Russian President Vladimir Putin proposed bilateral talks with Ukraine for the first time since the early days of the conflict, and his Ukrainian counterpart Volodymyr Zelenskyy said Kyiv was eager to discuss a halt to attacks on civilian targets. Russia and Ukraine have said they are open to further ceasefires after a 30-hour Easter truce declared by Moscow at the weekend. Each side accused the other of violating it. Putin said fighting had resumed after the Easter ceasefire, which he announced unilaterally on Saturday. And Moscow was open to any peace initiatives and expected the same from Kyiv.
Kyiv regime is trying to seize the initiative and talk about expanding the time frame and the targets. But we must think about it and carefully assess everything and look at the results. If you paid attention, I said from the very beginning, when I met with the Chief of the General Staff, that we would see what the experience of the Easter truce would be like. Overall, still, there has been a reduction in activity. We welcome that and we are ready to look at the future.
While Zelenskyy did not respond directly to Putin's proposal, he emphasized that Ukraine was ready for any conversation about a ceasefire that would stop strikes on the civilians. Zelenskyy said Ukraine will take part in talks with the US and European countries on Wednesday in London.
Today was almost entirely dedicated to working with partners in various formats. We are preparing meetings for Wednesday with partners from Europe, the UK, France, Germany and from the United States. These meetings can bring us closer to a ceasefire and a real lasting peace.
And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has accused Russia of carrying out nearly 3,000 violations of the Easter truce his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin had announced. Zelenskyy said that Ukraine stood by its proposal for an end to attacks on civilian targets and was ready for any form of discussion to achieve it. Zelenskyy also said that Kyiv was sending a delegation to talks in London on Wednesday with Western countries on finding a resolution to the conflict with Ukraine.
Today was almost entirely dedicated to working with partners in various formats. We are preparing meetings for Wednesday with partners from Europe, the UK, France, Germany and from the United States. These meetings can bring us closer to a ceasefire and a real lasting peace.
And for more, we have Akshay Tongre joining us on this. Well, Akshay, this is the first time President Putin has publicly proposed bilateral talks since the early days of the war. How do we perceive this shift, especially when both the sides have been blaming each other for the truce violations?
Well, yes, there have been allegations by both Russia and Ukraine that the other side has violated the ceasefire of Easter that was announced in advance. However, it's a good sign that both the leaders are now coming out, though not talking to each other directly or responding to each other's statement that they are issuing, but both are now talking about a ceasefire or a peace plan so that war can stop, the conflict can stop, attacks against the civilian infrastructure can be halted as well. And the reason for that also seems conspicuously because a few days back itself, the US government had clarified that Ukraine's NATO membership is now off the table. However, initially when that statement was issued, there were certain skeptics that were questioning the reliability or credibility of a statement like that coming in from the US government, especially at a time when their stance keeps on changing. However, also questions were whether the European partners of Ukraine will be backing its NATO membership despite the US calling the deal off the table. However, what it seems at this point in time is that the Russian leadership is now moving towards calling for a ceasefire as well, which is happening after about 3 years of war, bloodshed, a lot of civilian losses, lives of civilians have been lost, lives of a lot of soldiers have been lost, families destroyed, infrastructure damaged beyond repair at this point, not only in Ukraine but in Russia as well. So clearly a ceasefire is in not only in favor of both the countries but also the economy of Europe and the global economy as a whole, given the fact that already with the tariffs that are being implemented by the US government and other kind of restrictions that are taking place, conflicts that are happening around the world, level have already put a lot of stress on the global financial system, and perhaps a peace ceasefire or peace plan between the two countries can be a good news for the world itself. And also what we are following consistently is that the US has been calling for ceasefire and also business deals for both the countries, both Ukraine and Russia. We all know that when Donald Trump came into office, he talked about the rare earth minerals that can be taken from Ukraine or mined from Ukraine, not only for the Ukrainian government but also for the US in exchange for the kind of support that it has been providing the country, the kind of funding that has went in from the West and especially the US to the country in fighting this war. And now that the government of the United States has already pulled back in a major way from providing direct assistance to Ukraine, its position had weakened. It has been calling for ceasefires, and perhaps now what we are seeing directly is a result of the kind of pressures that have been built from across the world for both of these countries to stop the war. So there is now a beacon of hope, light at the end of the tunnel perhaps, but we are looking at both the leaders now directly talking about peace and a ceasefire, which can move into a good direction if the consistency of these efforts remain the same. Back to you.
All right, Akshay. Also, will both sides now signaling openness to the ceasefire discussions in Ukraine, of course, heading into key talks with Western allies in London tomorrow? What are the chances of meaningful progress?
Well, at this point, there is high hope that there will be a meaningful progress with both Putin and Zelensky talking about peace, because quite honestly, Russia has already invaded certain parts of Donbass, Donetsk. The objectives that Russia had are almost fulfilled. NATO membership is off the table for Ukraine. Certain Russian-speaking areas that wanted to integrate back with Russia in Ukraine have already been annexed by the Russian army. Crimea is already with Russia now. The only thing that keeps on this war from continuing is the US support. If it halts, then the war halts. If the support from the Western allies continue, then Ukraine certainly will make an effort to win back the territories that it has lost since the war escalated in 2022. Because if you look at the war, it's not just 3 years of war. Ever since Crimea was annexed by Russia, in a sense, the Russo-Ukrainian war has started, and it has been over a decade of hostilities between the two countries. Perhaps it's time now for some sort of sense and stability in that part of the region.
All right. Thank you so much, Akshay, for all that information.